The wind changed direction so fast that the candles on the garden table blew out in one breath, and Eleanor Hartley felt the first cold drop of rain land on her bare shoulder before anyone else noticed the sky had turned black. She did not move. She stood at the edge of the Duke's garden party, holding a small glass of lemon water, watching a group of men laugh under a striped tent, and she already knew, without being told, that something was about to go badly wrong that night. It was the way the wheat fields beyond the hedges had gone still. Not swaying, not rustling. Still, the way a held breath is still before someone shouts. Ashford Whitmore, the Duke of Merrow Hall, stood near the punch table, with his glass raised, mid-laugh, mid-sentence, mid-everything he thought his life was supposed to be. He had not looked toward the fields once all evening. He had not looked toward Eleanor either, not really, though she was standing close enough to hear every word he said next. A woman like Lady Hartley, he said, tilting his head toward her without lowering his voice, clearly enjoying an audience, would weep at the very sight of mud. Can you imagine her walking a plowed field in the rain? She would faint before she reached the second row. The men around him laughed. One of them glanced at Eleanor, saw she had heard every word, and had the decency to look uncomfortable. The Duke did not notice. He was already turning back to his glass, already moving on to some other clever remark, already forgetting she existed the moment the laugh faded. Eleanor set her glass down on the table without a sound. She did not cry. She did not storm away. She simply turned the words over once in her mind, the way she turned over a coin to check both sides, and she decided, quietly and without drama, that the Duke of Merrow Hall did not know the first thing about her, and one day he would. She did not know that day would come sooner than either of them expected, and that it would come wrapped in wind and thunder and the ruin of an entire harvest. The storm that night passed without much damage. It rattled shutters and knocked over 2 garden chairs and sent the guests scrambling for their carriages, laughing about wet hems and ruined shoes. By morning the sun was out again, and the Duke had already forgotten what he said, the way careless men often forget the small cruelties they hand out at parties. Eleanor had not forgotten. She never did. She rode home that night in her family's old carriage, the wheels splashing through puddles that had not been there an hour before, and she watched the dark fields pass by the window, the Duke's fields, stretching wide and endless on both sides of the road, wheat bending low under the wind. She thought about how much depended on that wheat. Not just the Duke's income, not just his fine dinners and his fine words, but the people who worked that land. Families who lived in small stone cottages at the edge of his estate, families who had nothing else to depend on when winter came. She thought, briefly, that a man who joked so easily about mud had probably never once thought about what mud meant to the people who lived closest to it. Eleanor's own home, Ivy Grange, sat just beyond the eastern border of the Duke's land, close enough that their fields nearly touched, separated only by a low stone wall and a narrow stream that ran fast in spring and slow in summer. Her father had died 2 winters ago, leaving behind a manor with too many rooms and too little money, and a daughter who had learned very quickly that grief did not pay the bills, and that society's sympathy lasted only as long as it took to whisper about someone else's misfortune. What society did not know, what the Duke certainly did not know, was that Eleanor had spent those 2 winters doing something no lady in her circle would admit to doing. She had taken over the management of what remained of her father's land herself. She rode out at dawn most mornings, before the house even stirred, wearing an old riding coat that had belonged to her father, far too large in the shoulders, patched at the elbow, the kind of coat that would have scandalized every woman at the garden party the night before. She walked the fields with the tenant families, learned which soil held water and which drained too fast, learned when to plant and when to wait, learned the names of every child in every cottage on her land because she had decided, early on, that if she was going to keep her home standing, she would need to understand it from the ground up, not from a drawing room. Her mother, Lady Margaret Hartley, disapproved deeply, though she had long since given up trying to stop her daughter. Margaret preferred to imagine that Eleanor spent her mornings walking for exercise and her afternoons doing needlework, and she chose not to ask too many questions about the mud on Eleanor's boots or the calluses forming on her hands. "You will ruin your prospects," her mother had said once, watching Eleanor return from the fields with dirt on her sleeves. "No gentleman wants a wife who looks like she has been digging potatoes." "Then I suppose I will not marry a gentleman who cares more about my sleeves than my sense," Eleanor had answered, and her mother had sighed the particular sigh of a woman who had given up an argument long before it started. Eleanor did not care what society thought of her hands. She cared about the ledger books stacked in her father's old study, the columns of numbers that told her exactly how close her family was to losing everything, and the tenant families whose faces she saw every morning, families who trusted her, even though she was young, even though she was a woman, even though half the county whispered that Lord Hartley's daughter had lost her sense along with her father. She had not lost anything. She had found something. She had found that she was better with numbers and soil and weather patterns than she had ever been with polite conversation, and she found a strange, fierce comfort in that discovery. The morning after the garden party, Eleanor rose before dawn as she always did, pulled on her father's old coat, and walked out to the eastern field, where a group of workers were repairing a section of fence that had blown down in the storm. Among them was Edward Fenwick, a tenant farmer who worked a strip of land close to the border between the Hartley estate and the Dukes, a quiet man with rough hands and a kindness in his eyes that had earned him the trust of everyone who knew him. "Bad wind last night," Edward said, nodding toward the sky, as if the storm might still be hiding up there. "Heard it took down half the tent at the big house." "It took down 2 chairs," Eleanor said, and Edward laughed, the sound rough and warm. "His Grace throw one of his parties again?" "He did. And I suppose the wheat out there doesn't concern him much, seeing as he's got a whole season before it needs bringing in." Eleanor paused at that, her hand resting on a fence post. "Bringing in? His fields are further along than ours," Edward said, not thinking much of the comment, already moving on to hammering another post into the ground. "That western side gets more sun. He'll be cutting before we are, most likely. Not that it's my business what the Duke does with his own land." Eleanor said nothing more about it, but the comment stayed with her the way certain small facts do, tucked away in the back of the mind until the moment they become important. She spent the rest of that day the way she spent most days, walking her own fields, checking the drainage near the stream, speaking with the other tenant families about the coming weeks, and by the time she returned to Ivy Grange that evening, her boots were caked in mud up to the ankle, exactly the kind of mud the Duke had joked about the night before, exactly the kind of mud he imagined would send her fainting to the ground. She stood at her bedroom window that night, looking out at the dark shapes of the fields stretching toward the horizon, the Duke's land lying somewhere beyond the last visible hedge, and she thought about how strange it was that a man could stand so close to something as vast and demanding as a harvest and understand so little about what it actually required. She did not know yet how soon that understanding would be tested. She did not know that within days, the sky above those very fields would turn the color of a bruise, that the wind would rise until it howled through the hedgerows, that a storm far worse than the one at the garden party would come rolling in from the west with enough force to flatten every stalk of wheat still standing in the ground. She did not know that when it came, she would be the one riding straight toward it, while every rational person in the county rode the other way. But that night, standing at her window with mud still on her boots, Eleanor Hartley only knew one thing for certain. She had been underestimated her whole life, by her mother, by society, by nearly every man she had ever met, and each time it happened, she had learned to let the underestimation pass without argument, because words rarely changed anyone's mind. Actions did. She closed the window, blew out her candle, and went to sleep without giving the Duke of Merrow Hall another thought, unaware that within a matter of days, she would be riding through the worst storm of the season, straight onto his land, to save the very harvest he had never once imagined she would care about, let alone rescue with her own 2 hands. The wheel of fortune, as her father used to say, rarely announces its turning in advance. It simply turns, quietly, while everyone is looking somewhere else, and by the time anyone notices, the world has already changed shape. That was exactly how it happened, in the days that followed, though on that particular night, under a sky finally clearing after the storm, nobody at Ivy Grange or Merrow Hall had the faintest idea what was coming. 3 days after the garden party, a letter arrived at Ivy Grange that made Eleanor's mother drop her teacup into its saucer with a sharp clatter. It was from a distant cousin in the city, full of gossip about a young officer who had recently returned from abroad, and Lady Margaret Hartley read it twice, out loud, with growing excitement, already imagining introductions and dinners, and the sort of match that might finally repair the family's fortunes through marriage rather than mud. Eleanor listened politely, nodded at the right moments, and excused herself as soon as she could, because she had ledgers to check and a meeting with the tenant families about the eastern drainage ditch, which had not fully recovered from the storm. This was the rhythm of her days, and it had been the rhythm for 2 years now. Her mother lived in a world of letters and introductions and careful hopes, while Eleanor lived in a world of soil moisture and grain prices and the quiet arithmetic of survival. The two worlds shared a roof, but rarely shared a conversation. Ivy Grange had once been a grand house, in the way many old country houses had once been grand, with high ceilings and long windows, and a name that meant something at county gatherings. Eleanor's father, Lord Charles Hartley, had been a warm and generous man, quick to laugh, slow to worry about money, and it was this last quality that had left his family in a difficult position after his sudden death. He had trusted the wrong steward with the accounts for years. By the time Eleanor discovered the truth, sitting alone in her father's study late one night, with a stack of ledgers and a growing sense of dread, the family's finances were in a state far worse than anyone outside the house suspected. Debts had piled quietly for years, hidden behind good manners and a full dinner table, and it fell to Eleanor, the only child, unmarried and only 22 years old, to decide what to do about it. She could have done what most young women in her position did. She could have leaned entirely on the hope of marriage, put herself forward at every gathering, smiled at every eligible gentleman, and waited for someone else to solve the problem for her. Instead, she had walked out to the fields one gray morning, alone, wearing her father's old coat because her own was too fine for the mud, and she had simply started asking questions. What grows well here? What sells for a fair price? What the tenant families needed from her, and what she could reasonably ask of them in return. She had made mistakes in that first year, plenty of them, planted the wrong crop in a field that flooded every spring, trusted a merchant who shorted her on payment, misjudged how much grain to keep back for the tenants through winter. But she had learned, and by the second year, Ivy Grange was no longer sinking. It was not thriving, not yet, but it was steady, and steady felt like a victory worth having. None of this appeared anywhere in the letters her mother received from the city. None of it appeared in the whispered conversations at garden parties, where the only version of Eleanor Hartley that existed was a quiet, slightly odd young woman who had strange habits and no fortune to speak of. The Duke of Merrow Hall certainly knew nothing of it. He knew Eleanor Hartley as a name on a guest list, a face at the edge of a garden, a convenient subject for a joke when he wanted to seem clever in front of his friends. Ashford Whitmore had inherited Merrow Hall 4 years earlier, at the age of 26, when his own father passed away, rather suddenly of a weak heart. The estate that came with the title was enormous, the largest in the county, with fields that stretched further than a man could ride in a single morning, and a staff of stewards and foremen and laborers who had, for generations, managed the land with a competence that had allowed successive dukes to spend most of their time thinking about anything except farming. Ashford was, by most accounts, not a cruel man. He was simply a man who had never needed to think carefully about consequences, because consequences had always been someone else's job to manage. He paid his tenants fairly, by the standards of the time. He attended church on the appropriate Sundays. He hosted parties that were considered among the finest in the county, and he genuinely believed, without much reflection, that his life was a good and generous one. What he had never done, not once in 26 years, was stand in a field during a storm and understand what it meant to lose everything a season's labor had built. His steward, a careful and aging man named Mr. Turner, had managed the estate's farming operations for nearly 30 years, since before Ashford was born, and it was Turner who quietly handled every difficult decision, so that the Duke never had to. Turner decided when to plant, when to harvest, who to hire during the busy season, how much grain to sell, and how much to keep back. Ashford signed papers when they were placed in front of him, and otherwise turned his attention to matters he found more interesting: hunting, correspondence with friends in the city, the occasional garden party. It was a comfortable arrangement, and it had worked well for years, right up until the week Mr. Turner fell ill. It started as a cough, nothing anyone worried much about, but within days, the cough turned into a fever, and within a week, Turner was confined to his bed, unable to walk further than the door of his own cottage, let alone manage the largest harvest of the season. His foreman, a capable younger man named Daniel Cobb, would normally have stepped in without much trouble, but Daniel had been called away to his sister's household 2 counties over, where her husband had been badly hurt in an accident with a cart, and family duty demanded he stay until the man recovered enough to manage on his own. This left Merrow Hall's farming operation, at the very moment the wheat stood ready and the weather was beginning to turn unpredictable, with no one at the helm who truly understood what needed to happen next. Ashford did not fully grasp the seriousness of the situation until nearly a week after the garden party, when he rode out to the western fields on a whim, curious about the wheat he had heard so much about at dinner, and found the fields quieter than they should have been. A handful of laborers worked at a pace that seemed slower than urgency required, and when he asked one of them bluntly what the delay was, the man had simply shrugged and said that without Mr. Turner or Daniel Cobb giving orders, nobody quite knew how many hands they needed, or how soon, or in what order the fields ought to be cut. Ashford had felt, for the first time in his adult life, a flicker of something close to worry. He rode back to the house and sent for the local weather almanac, and what he read there did nothing to ease that flicker. A storm system was building over the coast, larger than the one that had passed through during his garden party, and by the estimates of 2 separate weathermen consulted in the county, it was expected to reach Merrow Hall's fields within a matter of days, bringing winds strong enough to flatten standing wheat and rain heavy enough to rot whatever was left lying in the mud. If the wheat was not cut and brought in before that storm arrived, the harvest, the largest source of income for the estate, and the entire winter's food supply for dozens of tenant families, would be ruined in a single night. Ashford stood at his study window that evening, looking out at fields he had rarely paid close attention to, fields that stretched gold and heavy under a sky that seemed, even now, to be gathering itself for something enormous, and for the first time he understood, in a distant and uncomfortable way, that the comfortable life he had always taken for granted rested entirely on things he did not know how to do himself. He sent urgent messages to neighboring estates asking for spare laborers. Most had none to offer, their own harvests demanding every available hand. He considered riding to the city to hire workers, but the nearest town large enough to provide extra hands was 2 days away, and the storm, by every account, was closer than that. He did not think, not even once, to send word to Ivy Grange, because it had simply never occurred to him that help of any real use might come from that direction. Eleanor, meanwhile, spent those same days finishing repairs on her own eastern drainage ditch, checking her own fields, unaware that just beyond the low stone wall separating her land from the Duke's, an entire harvest stood in growing danger, tended by too few hands, and led by no one who fully understood what was coming. It was Edward Fenwick who first brought her the news, 3 days later, arriving at Ivy Grange just after dawn, with his hat in his hands, and worry plain across his face. "Might not be my place to say anything, my lady," he began, and Eleanor, sensing immediately that whatever he had to say mattered a great deal, told him to speak plainly, and quickly. "It's the Duke's western fields," Edward said, words going round among the tenant families. "Turner's took ill. Bad enough he can't leave his bed. Cobb's away tending his own family trouble. There's hardly anyone left out there who knows how to run a harvest properly. And there's a storm coming in off the coast, a big one, worse than anything we've had this season. If that wheat isn't cut in time, it'll all be lost, every bit of it." Eleanor set down the cup of tea she had been holding, her mind already moving faster than her hand. "How much time?" she asked. "A day," Edward said. "Maybe less." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing at all. She thought of the Duke's careless words at the garden party, the easy laugh, the certainty that a woman like her would faint at the sight of real mud. She thought of the tenant families on his land, families she did not know personally, but families exactly like the ones on her own land, families who depended entirely on a good harvest to survive the winter ahead, families who had nothing to do with the Duke's careless jokes and everything to lose if his fields were ruined. She thought, too, of her own harvest, still weeks away, still safe for now, and of how easily this could have been her own fields facing ruin, her own tenant families facing a hungry winter, if fortune had simply shuffled the timing a little differently. She stood up from the table so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Edward," she said, "how many strong hands do we have free this morning?" "A handful, my lady." "Why?" Gather them, she said, already moving toward the door, already calling for her boots and her father's old coat. We're riding to Marrow Hall. At Marrow Hall, the morning had begun with a kind of quiet dread that Ashford Whitmore had never experienced before in his life. He stood in the doorway of Mr. Turner's cottage, watching the old steward struggle to sit up in bed, his face pale and damp with fever, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You mustn't try to speak," Ashford said, though he had come precisely because he needed Turner to speak, needed him to explain, in whatever strength he had left, exactly what needed to happen to the western fields before the storm arrived. Turner ignored the instruction, as loyal old servants often do when they sense their master is in real trouble. "The western field goes first, Your Grace," he rasped. "It ripened earliest. It's most exposed. The wind will take it first if it isn't cut. You'll need every hand you can find, and you'll need someone who knows how to organize the cutting so the grain doesn't sit wet in the rows waiting to be carted. If it sits wet even a few hours, it'll rot before it ever reaches the barn." "How many hands?" Ashford asked, though he already suspected the answer would not comfort him. "Normally 40, Your Grace, working from dawn until the light goes. With the storm coming, you'd want more, and you'd want them today, not tomorrow." Ashford did a quick, unhappy count in his head. He had perhaps 15 laborers currently available on the estate, most of them older men or very young boys, since the strongest hands had already been sent to help shore up the flooding creek embankment on the northern boundary, a project that could not simply be abandoned without risking the flooding of an entire village downstream. 15 hands against a task that needed 40, with a storm bearing down faster than any messenger could summon help from elsewhere. He left Turner's cottage with a heaviness in his chest he did not have a name for, and he rode straight to the northern boundary, hoping he might pull at least some of the men back from the embankment project. What he found there only deepened his worry. The creek had already risen dangerously with the early rains from the coastal storm system, and the embankment, hastily reinforced days earlier, was showing signs of giving way in 2 places. If it broke before the storm even arrived properly, the village of Hollowbeck downstream would flood within hours. There was no possibility of pulling men away from that work. Lives, not just crops, depended on it holding. Ashford rode back toward the manor house feeling, for the first time, the true weight of the responsibility he had inherited along with his title. It was not a weight of paperwork and signatures. It was a weight of people, dozens of families whose winter depended on decisions being made correctly, right now, by someone who barely understood what those decisions required. He passed a small stone cottage near the edge of the western field and saw a woman standing in the doorway, a baby balanced on her hip, watching the darkening sky, with an expression Ashford recognized immediately, because he had begun to feel it himself. It was the particular fear of someone who understood exactly how much was at stake and could do nothing to change the outcome alone. The woman was Susan Pretty, wife of Walter Pretty, a tenant farmer who had worked the western field for nearly 15 years. Ashford reined in his horse and greeted her, and she curtsied quickly, shifting the baby to her other hip. "Your Grace," she said, "forgive me for asking, but is it true about the storm? Walter's been saying the wheat won't be in time, not with the hands we've got." Ashford considered lying, considered offering some comfortable reassurance, the way he had always offered comfortable reassurances at dinner parties, but something in the woman's face stopped him. "I won't pretend it isn't a difficult situation," he said instead, "but I intend to find a solution before the day is out." Susan nodded, though her eyes stayed worried, and Ashford rode on toward the manor, with her expression fixed uncomfortably in his mind. He thought of her children. He thought of Turner's decades of loyal service, and of Daniel Cobb, hurrying home to help his own injured brother-in-law while his duties here went unmanaged. He thought of every family on his land whose entire winter rested on wheat that was standing, right now, in a field, waiting for someone to organize its rescue. He had never once, in 26 years, felt the true shape of that responsibility, and now that he felt it, he did not know quite what to do with the feeling, except let it push him faster. Back at the manor house, he called together every servant who could be spared from the house itself, footmen, stable hands, even the younger kitchen boys, and set them walking toward the western field, with instructions to help however they could. It brought his numbers up to perhaps 22, still well short of what Turner had said was needed, and none of them experienced enough to know how to organize a harvest properly under pressure. He sent a rider to the nearest town, 2 days away by fast horse, though he knew even a rider moving at full speed could not possibly return with help before the storm arrived. It was, he understood, even as he gave the order, closer to a gesture of desperation than a real plan. By mid-afternoon, the sky over Marrow Hall had begun to change in a way that made even the most inexperienced laborer glance upward with unease. Clouds were gathering along the western horizon, dark and low, moving with a speed that suggested the storm was arriving faster than the almanac had predicted. The wind, still gentle for now, carried a coolness that had not been there that morning, the particular coolness that farmers everywhere learned to recognize as the leading edge of something much larger. Ashford stood at the edge of the western field, watching his small, mismatched group of servants and elderly laborers attempt to organize themselves without any clear direction, watching the wheat sway restlessly under a wind that was only going to grow stronger, and he felt something close to panic settle into his chest. It was not the panic of a man losing money, though the financial loss would be significant. It was the panic of a man who had suddenly and completely understood, in the space of a single day, that an entire winter's survival for dozens of families rested on his shoulders, and that he did not have the first idea how to carry that weight properly. He thought, briefly and uselessly, of the garden party a week earlier, of laughing with his friends about mud and fainting ladies, and the memory felt suddenly small and foolish against the reality standing in front of him now, a field of ripe wheat and a gathering storm, and not nearly enough hands to save either. He did not know, as he stood there watching the sky darken, that just beyond the low stone wall marking the eastern border of his land, a small group of riders was already moving toward him at a fast, determined pace, led by a woman he had mocked without ever really seeing her, a woman who understood exactly what needed to happen in a field before a storm, because she had spent 2 years learning it with her own hands. He did not know that within the hour, his fields would no longer feel quite so hopeless, and that the person who changed that would be the very last person he expected. The wind picked up again, sharper this time, bending the wheat in long golden waves, and somewhere far off, low and distant, the first roll of thunder sounded across the darkening sky. Eleanor reached the low stone wall separating Ivy Grange from Marrow Hall, just as the first true gust of wind swept across the fields, strong enough to pull loose strands of hair free from beneath her hat. Behind her rode 6 men from her own estate, Edward Fenwick among them, along with 2 younger farmhands and 3 older workers who had known Eleanor's father and trusted his daughter, without needing to ask many questions about why she had suddenly ordered them onto a horse and pointed them toward the Duke's land. It was not a large group. It was not nearly enough hands to save an entire harvest on its own, but Eleanor had learned something in 2 years of managing her own struggling estate that she suspected the Duke had never needed to learn, which was that the right kind of organization could make a small number of hands do the work of a much larger number, if someone directed the effort with enough clarity and speed. She led her small group over the low wall, at a point where the stones had crumbled enough to allow the horses through safely, and within minutes, she could see the western fields spread out before her, wide and golden, and already bending dangerously under the strengthening wind. She could also see, scattered across that field, a disorganized cluster of servants and elderly laborers, moving without any clear pattern, some cutting wheat with scythes, in a manner that suggested they had rarely done the work before, others standing uncertainly near half-loaded carts, clearly waiting for instructions that were not coming. Eleanor did not waste time looking for the Duke. She rode straight into the middle of the field, dismounted quickly, and called out to the nearest cluster of workers, in a voice pitched to carry over the rising wind. "Who is cutting the northern edge of this field?" A young footman, still wearing the remains of his household uniform beneath a borrowed work coat, blinked at her in confusion. "Nobody's been told to, my lady. We've mostly been cutting where we happen to be standing." "That will not do," Eleanor said, already moving toward the edge of the field, assessing the slope of the land, the direction of the wind, the position of the carts waiting to carry the cut wheat back toward the barns. "The wind is coming from the west. Whatever is left standing longest will take the worst of it. We cut the western edge first, working east, so that as each section falls, the next section is already positioned to be gathered without wasted movement. Anyone not currently cutting, form a line for gathering and carting. We move as one motion, not scattered pieces. The footman stared at her for a moment, clearly unused to taking direction from a woman he did not recognize, dressed in a mud-stained coat far too large for her, but something in her voice, calm and utterly certain, cut through his hesitation, faster than any argument could have. "Yes, my lady," he said, and turned to relay her instructions to the others. Eleanor's own men fell into position immediately, familiar with this kind of coordinated work from their years, managing Ivy Grange's fields, and within a remarkably short time, the western field began to take on a shape and rhythm it had been badly lacking all day. Cutters moved in a steady line from west to east, following the direction Eleanor had set. Behind them, gatherers bundled the cut wheat into sheaves with practiced speed, the kind of speed that came only from having done the work many times before under real pressure. The carts, which had been sitting half-loaded and idle, began moving in a steady rotation toward the barns, returning empty, just as the next load was ready. Eleanor did not stand back and direct from a distance. She moved through the field herself, cutting where cutting was needed, gathering where gathering was needed, her father's old coat quickly gathering streaks of dirt and crushed wheat, her hands, already familiar with this kind of labor from 2 years at Ivy Grange, falling easily into the same rhythm she demanded from everyone around her. An older laborer working near her, a man with a weathered face and decades of harvest experience behind him, glanced at her more than once with an expression of frank surprise. "Begging your pardon, my lady," he said eventually, unable to hold back his curiosity any longer. "But where did a lady learn to organize a field like this?" "The same place anyone learns anything," Eleanor said, not slowing her work. "By needing to." The wind continued to strengthen as the afternoon wore on, and the sky overhead darkened steadily, from a pale gray to something closer to slate, heavy clouds rolling in from the coast, with a speed that left no room for comfort. Thunder rumbled again, closer now, and a few of the younger servants glanced nervously toward the horizon, clearly torn between the urgency of the work and a growing instinct to seek shelter. Eleanor felt the same instinct herself, the same primal awareness that the sky above them was building toward something dangerous, but she pushed it aside the way she had learned to push aside fear during 2 years of hard decisions, because the wheat, still standing in that field, represented more than grain. It represented the winter meals of every family whose cottage bordered these acres, families who had nothing to do with garden parties or careless jokes about mud, families who simply needed this harvest to survive the cold months ahead. She thought, briefly, of Susan Pretty and her children, though she did not yet know their names, families she had never met but understood instinctively, because they were no different from the families on her own land. Families whose fate rested entirely on whether enough wheat made it into the barns before the storm arrived. That thought was enough to keep her moving, scythe in hand, through a field that grew darker and windier with every passing hour, leading a small group of exhausted but increasingly organized workers toward a goal that had, only an hour earlier, seemed impossible to reach. She did not notice, at first, the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast from the direction of the manor house, nor the figure of a man on horseback who had just been told, by a breathless young stable boy, that a woman he did not recognize had ridden onto his land, and was, according to every account reaching him, currently running his entire harvest operation. Ashford Whitmore had been standing near the barns, watching helplessly as his mismatched group of servants struggled against a task too large for their numbers, when the stable boy reached him with the strange news. At first he assumed some misunderstanding, some confusion among the frightened workers, but the boy insisted, wide-eyed and certain. "She's out there cutting wheat herself, Your Grace. Got the whole field moving different. Faster, like she's done it 100 times before. Nobody knows her name proper, but old Harmon says she rode in from the east, over the stone wall." Ashford felt a strange, unfamiliar mixture of confusion and hope rise in his chest, and without pausing to question it further, he swung up onto his horse and turned it toward the western field, riding straight into the wind, straight toward a scene he could not yet imagine, and straight toward a reckoning with everything he had once said, carelessly and without a second thought, about a woman he assumed he already understood. The first real rain arrived, not as a gentle warning, but as a sudden heavy sheet of water, as if the sky had simply decided, without further patience, to release everything it had been holding back. Eleanor felt it soak through her coat within seconds, cold and immediate, and around her she heard several of the younger workers gasp and stumble, unused to working through weather this severe. She did not stop moving. She had expected this moment, had known from the moment she crossed the stone wall that the rain would come before the wheat was fully in, and she had already decided, somewhere in the back of her mind, exactly how the group would need to adjust once it did. "Keep cutting," she called out, raising her voice over the sudden roar of rain against the wheat stalks. "Wet wheat is still better than wheat that's been flattened by wind and left lying in the mud. We move faster now, not slower." A few of the workers hesitated, glancing toward the manor house, as if shelter might suddenly seem like the wiser choice. But Edward Fenwick, working near the front of the cutting line, called out in his own steady voice, backing Eleanor's instruction without hesitation. "You heard her. Keep the line moving. We've come this far, we're not stopping for a little wet." The rain, however, was only the beginning. Within minutes it had shifted from heavy to fierce, driven sideways by a wind that had grown strong enough to bend the standing wheat almost flat in places, and Eleanor understood immediately that they had entered a new and more dangerous phase of the work. Wheat that lay flat under wind and rain became far harder to cut cleanly, and worse, it became far easier to lose entirely, trampled into the mud by careless feet, or left rotting where it fell if nobody reached it in time. She adjusted her instructions quickly, calling the cutters to work in smaller, faster teams, moving section by section rather than in one long continuous line, so that no part of the field was left exposed to the wind for longer than necessary. It was a change born entirely of instinct and 2 years of hard-won experience, the kind of adjustment that came not from books or lessons, but from having stood in fields exactly like this one before, watching crops nearly lost to weather she could not control. The older laborer working near her, the same man who had asked earlier where a lady had learned such things, glanced at her again through the driving rain, water streaming down his weathered face, and this time he said nothing at all. He simply nodded, once, the nod of a man who had stopped questioning what he was seeing, and had instead decided, quietly and completely, to trust it. Behind them, the gatherers worked with increasing urgency, bundling wheat into sheaves as fast as their soaked and slipping hands allowed, hauling them toward the waiting carts through mud that had, in the space of 20 minutes, transformed the once solid field path into something closer to a shallow river. Eleanor's boots and the hem of her father's old coat were entirely soaked through with mud now, exactly the mud the Duke had once joked would send her fainting to the ground. She did not think of him in that moment. She thought only of the wheat, of the carts, of the sound of thunder growing steadily closer, of the growing certainty that the true force of the storm had not yet even arrived, and that whatever they managed to save in the next hour might be all they managed to save at all. A young stable boy working near one of the carts slipped in the mud and went down hard, his ankle twisting awkwardly beneath him, and he cried out in sudden pain. Eleanor was at his side within seconds, kneeling in the mud beside him, checking the ankle with quick, practiced hands. "It's not broken," she said, after a moment, relief evident in her voice. "But you won't be walking well on it for a few days. Can you still use your arms?" The boy nodded, wincing. "Then sit here and help load the cart from where you are. Don't put weight on that ankle again today." She helped him shift to a position near the cart where he could still contribute without further injury, and then she was moving again, back into the rhythm of the field, because there was no time to linger, not with the sky continuing to darken and the wind continuing to rise. It was in the midst of this chaos, rain driving sideways, thunder rolling closer with every passing minute, wheat bending, and workers slipping through rapidly forming mud, that Eleanor first heard the sound of a horse approaching at a hard gallop from the direction of the manor house. She did not turn immediately. She was in the middle of directing a group of gatherers toward a section of wheat that had begun to lie flat under the wind, and the work in front of her demanded her full attention before anything else could claim it. It was only when the horse drew close enough that its rider called out, a voice raised sharply over the storm, that Eleanor finally straightened and turned to see who had arrived. The rider was soaked through already, his fine coat plastered dark against his shoulders, his hair flattened by rain, and for a moment, Eleanor did not recognize him at all, so different did he look from the polished, laughing figure she had seen at the garden party only days before. Then she saw his face clearly, and recognition arrived all at once. It was the Duke of Marrow Hall, sitting astride a horse that was clearly unsettled by the storm, staring down at the field in front of him, with an expression Eleanor had never once seen him wear, an expression that had nothing to do with careless jokes or easy laughter. It was the expression of a man who had just realized in a single overwhelming instant that everything he thought he knew about the world and about the woman standing in front of him, mud-streaked and rain-soaked and utterly unafraid, had been entirely and completely wrong. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the rain hammering down between them, the wind howling across a field that was, thanks to Eleanor's efforts, still being saved from ruin, one desperate section at a time. Then Ashford Whitmore did something Eleanor had not expected at all. He swung down from his horse, landed hard in the mud, without any apparent concern for his fine boots, and walked straight toward her, his voice barely audible over the storm, but carrying, unmistakably, a note of something close to disbelief. "Lady Hartley," he said, "what in heaven's name are you doing on my land?" Eleanor wiped rain from her eyes with the back of a muddy hand, and did not hesitate for even a moment before answering. "Saving your harvest, Your Grace," she said, "unless you'd rather stand there talking while it's lost." For a long moment, Ashford simply stood there in the driving rain, staring at Eleanor, as if she were a puzzle he had suddenly been handed, with no instructions on how to solve it. He had come to this field expecting confusion, expecting to find some strange misunderstanding at the root of the stable boy's breathless report. What he found instead was a field that, despite the worsening storm, had somehow taken on a rhythm and order that his own scattered group of servants had failed to create all day. Workers moved with purpose. Carts rotated steadily between the field and the barns. Wheat that had seemed doomed only an hour earlier was being cut, gathered, and hauled to safety with a speed that startled him. And at the center of it all stood the woman he had mocked at his own garden party, soaked through, streaked with mud from her boots to her shoulders, giving instructions with the calm authority of someone who had done this work 100 times before. "You're organizing my entire harvest," he said, still struggling to fit the sight in front of him into anything he had previously believed to be true. "Someone needed to," Eleanor said, already turning back toward the field, clearly unwilling to spend precious time explaining herself, while wheat remained uncut. "Your steward is ill, and your foreman is away, and whoever has been directing your workers today has been sending them to cut wherever they happen to be standing, rather than working with the wind. That wastes time you do not have." Ashford felt something sharp and uncomfortable twist in his chest, an emotion close to shame, though he had rarely felt genuine shame in his adult life. He had spent the entire day feeling helpless, watching his fields fall further into disorder, and here was a woman he had dismissed without a second thought, arriving uninvited, and solving in an hour a problem he had failed to solve all day. "Tell me what you need," he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, stripped of his usual polish, because there was no room left in him for polish, not standing in this field, in this rain, in front of this woman. Eleanor glanced at him, assessing him quickly the way she assessed everything, weighing whether his offer was genuine or merely another empty gesture from a man used to letting others do the difficult work. "Can you cut wheat?" she asked bluntly. "I have never done so in my life." "Then you'll gather instead. Watch how the sheaves are bundled, keep them tight so they don't fall apart in the mud, and get them to the nearest cart as quickly as you can. We do not have time for you to learn slowly." For one brief instant, old habit rose in Ashford, the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life being deferred to, being asked rather than told, but he pushed it aside almost as quickly as it appeared, because some clearer part of him understood that deference had no place in a field racing against a storm, and that the woman giving him orders understood this field far better than he ever had. He picked up an armful of cut wheat from where it lay, and followed the example of the worker nearest him, awkward and slow at first, his fine clothes utterly ruined within minutes, his hands, unused to labor of any kind, quickly reddened and blistered by the rough stalks. He said nothing about the discomfort. He simply kept working, watching Eleanor out of the corner of his eye as she moved through the field with an ease that seemed almost impossible for someone who had, only days earlier, been the target of his own careless joke about fainting at the sight of mud. There was mud everywhere now, thick and clinging, coating everyone in the field equally, regardless of birth or title. And Eleanor moved through it, without hesitation, without complaint, without the faintest resemblance to the fragile, delicate creature Ashford had once imagined her to be. "You've done this before," he said eventually, working alongside her as they gathered a fallen section of wheat together, rain streaming down both their faces. It was not quite a question. "Every season for 2 years," Eleanor said, not slowing her pace. "Since my father died and left our accounts in worse shape than anyone realized, someone had to learn to manage the land properly, and there was no one else left to do it." Ashford absorbed this in silence for a moment, turning it over against everything he had assumed about her. He had pictured her spending her days at needlework and idle visits, the way he assumed most young women of her position spent their time, and it had never once occurred to him that behind the quiet, unremarkable face he barely remembered from various gatherings, there existed a woman who understood soil and weather and labor management well enough to organize, from nothing, a rescue of his entire harvest. "I said something cruel about you," he said abruptly, the words coming out before he had fully decided to speak them. "At my garden party. I don't imagine you've forgotten it." Eleanor did not look at him, focused instead on tying off a sheaf of wheat with quick, practiced movements. "I have not forgotten it," she said simply. "I was wrong," Ashford said, and something in his voice carried a weight that had not been there in his careless joke a week earlier. Entirely wrong. Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since arriving on his land, a small and fleeting smile, though the rain and the urgency of the work meant neither of them had time to dwell on the moment. "We can discuss how wrong you were once the wheat is safely in the barns, Your Grace," she said. "For now, there is more cutting to be done, and the storm is not waiting for either of us to finish our conversation." Ashford, to his own surprise, found himself almost laughing despite the circumstances, a short, startled sound, swallowed quickly by the wind. He picked up another armful of wheat and followed her deeper into the field, and for the first time since Turner had fallen ill, he felt something other than helpless dread settle into his chest. It was not confidence exactly. He still understood almost nothing about what he was doing, but it was something close to hope, the particular kind of hope that comes from realizing help has arrived from an unexpected direction, and that the person leading that help understood, better than he ever had, exactly what needed to be done. Above them, the sky continued to darken, and the wind continued to rise, and somewhere beyond the western horizon, the true heart of the storm was still gathering itself, moving steadily closer with every passing minute. By the time the western field was half cleared, the storm had grown into something far more dangerous than the steady rain that had marked its arrival. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, followed almost immediately by thunder loud enough to make several of the younger workers flinch and stumble in the mud. The wind had risen to a constant, howling force, tearing at loose clothing and driving rain nearly sideways across the field, and the wheat that remained standing bent and thrashed under its power, like something alive and struggling. Eleanor felt the danger of the moment settle over the field the way a shadow settles over open ground, but she also understood, with the same clear instinct that had guided every decision since she crossed the stone wall, that stopping now would waste everything they had already accomplished. Half a harvest saved was not enough. Whole families depended on every last portion of that wheat surviving the night. "We keep moving," she called out, raising her voice as much as she could over the wind. "But stay low when the lightning strikes close. Nobody stands near the metal blades or the cart frames when the sky flashes." Ashford, working nearby with wheat gathered awkwardly in his arms, glanced at her with an expression that mixed genuine worry with something close to admiration. He had never, in his entire life, heard anyone speak with such calm authority in the middle of genuine danger, and he found himself following her instructions without question, the way every other worker in the field had already begun to do. It was Peter, one of the younger stable hands recruited from the manor house that morning, who found himself in the greatest danger as the storm reached its worst point. He had been hauling a heavily loaded cart toward the barn, when one of its wooden wheels caught hard in a deep rut that the rain had turned into a small, swirling channel of water. The cart tilted sharply, threatening to spill its entire load of carefully gathered wheat into the mud, and Peter, trying desperately to hold it steady, lost his footing on the slick ground and went down hard, one leg trapped awkwardly beneath the tilting wheel. His cry of pain cut through the storm, and Eleanor was moving before she had fully registered the sound, sprinting across the muddy field with a speed that startled even the workers who had already come to respect her. She reached the cart within seconds, Ashford close behind her, and together they threw their weight against the tilted frame, straining to lift it enough for Peter to pull his leg free. The mud made every foothold treacherous, and for one terrible moment the cart seemed likely to tip fully, threatening to crush the trapped leg further. But Eleanor braced herself low, driving her shoulder hard against the wooden frame, and shouted for two of the nearby cutters to add their strength as well. With 4 sets of hands straining together, the cart finally lifted enough for Peter to scramble free, gasping and pale, his leg bruised badly but, to everyone's relief, not broken. "Get him to the barn," Eleanor ordered immediately, her voice steady despite her own ragged breathing. "Keep him warm and dry, and check that leg properly, once we're out of this rain." 2 of the older workers helped Peter hobble toward the shelter of the nearest barn, and Eleanor turned back to the remaining cart, already assessing how to right it and continue moving the load without losing more time. Ashford, still breathing hard from the effort of lifting the cart, looked at her with an expression that had shifted entirely from the confusion he had worn an hour earlier into something closer to genuine astonishment. "You moved before any of us even understood what was happening," he said. "There wasn't time to understand it slowly," Eleanor said, already directing 2 other workers to help her steady the righted cart. "Only time to act." They worked in this fashion for what felt like hours, though it was in truth closer to 2, racing against a storm that showed no sign of weakening, cutting and gathering, and hauling wheat through mud that grew deeper and more treacherous with every passing minute. Lightning continued to split the sky at intervals that grew disturbingly close together, and more than once the entire field fell into a strange, tense hush, as everyone waited for the accompanying crash of thunder, gauging by its speed just how close the lightning had actually struck. Despite the danger, despite the exhaustion visible on every face in the field, nobody stopped working. Eleanor's steady presence at the center of the effort seemed to anchor the entire group, her calm instructions cutting through both the physical chaos of the storm and the mental exhaustion of workers who had been laboring since before dawn. Ashford found himself, more than once, simply watching her in the brief pauses between tasks, unable to reconcile the woman working tirelessly beside him with the careless image he had carried of her for so long. There was nothing fragile about the way she moved through that field. There was nothing that suggested a woman who would faint at the sight of mud. If anything, the mud seemed to mean nothing to her at all, an irrelevant detail beside the far more important task of saving a harvest that was not even her own. He thought, in one of those brief pauses, of how many other assumptions he had likely made about people around him over the years. Assumptions built entirely on surface impressions, rather than any real understanding. And the thought left him uneasy in a way he suspected would take a long time to fully settle. As the last remaining section of wheat neared completion, the storm reached what felt like its most violent point yet. Wind tore across the field, with enough force to nearly knock several workers from their feet, and rain fell in such heavy sheets that visibility across the field dropped to only a few yards in every direction. Eleanor, soaked through and exhausted, her hands blistered and raw from hours of continuous labor, felt her own strength beginning to waver. But she pushed forward anyway, because the final wagon load of wheat was almost ready, and stopping now, with the barn so close, would mean losing everything they had fought this hard to save. "Last cart," she called out, her voice hoarse from hours of shouting over the wind. "Everyone to the barn the moment it's loaded. We've done what we came to do." Ashford, standing beside her, wheat gathered awkwardly in his aching arms, felt a surge of something he had never quite experienced before in his comfortable, sheltered life. It was not simply relief, though relief was certainly part of it. It was something closer to genuine respect, earned not through title or inheritance, but through hours of shared, desperate labor, beside a woman who had ridden onto his land uninvited, and, through sheer competence and refusal to give up, had saved something he had genuinely believed, only hours earlier, was already lost. Together, they loaded the final cart, and together, they turned it toward the barn, moving as fast as the treacherous mud allowed, the storm howling around them, with a fury that seemed, at last, to be reaching its absolute peak. The final cart reached the shelter of the barn, just as the storm released its full and terrible strength upon the fields behind them. The moment the last worker crossed the threshold, dragging the cart's wheels through the mud and into the relative safety of the barn's wide entrance, the wind outside rose to a howl, loud enough to rattle the heavy wooden doors on their hinges. Rain hammered against the roof with a force that sounded, From inside, almost like a continuous roll of distant thunder, and lightning flashed bright enough to throw stark white light through every gap and window in the old wooden structure. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway for a long moment, watching the storm she had raced against for hours finally arrive in its full, uncontested fury over the empty field behind them. Had they been even 20 minutes slower, she knew, the wheat now stacked safely inside the barn would instead be lying flattened and ruined in the mud outside, lost entirely to a storm that showed no mercy for timing. "We made it!" Ashford said beside her, his voice carrying a note of disbelief he made no effort to hide. "We did," Eleanor said, and allowed herself, finally, to feel the exhaustion she had been holding at bay for hours. Her arms ached, her hands were raw and blistered, her clothes were soaked through and heavy with mud. And yet beneath all of it, she felt something close to quiet triumph, the particular satisfaction of a difficult task, completed against real odds. Inside the barn, the workers who had labored alongside them all afternoon began settling into whatever dry corners they could find, exhausted but clearly relieved, their voices carrying a lightness that had been entirely absent only hours earlier. Someone produced a lantern, and its warm glow spread across stacks of freshly gathered wheat, safe now from the storm still raging outside. Peter, the young stable hand injured earlier by the tilting cart, sat propped against a stack of hay with his leg carefully wrapped, watching the activity around him with a pale but grateful expression. Eleanor made her way to him first, kneeling briefly to check the makeshift bandage one of the older workers had applied. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Sore, my lady, but I can wiggle my toes well enough," Peter said, managing a small smile. "Reckon I'll live to complain about it for weeks." "See that you do," Eleanor said, returning his smile before rising and moving back toward the center of the barn, where Ashford stood watching her with an expression she could not quite read. The other workers, sensing perhaps that their employer and this remarkable, mud-streaked woman had matters to discuss, drifted toward the far end of the barn, giving them a measure of privacy amid the general noise of the storm and the quiet murmur of relieved conversation. Ashford ran a hand through his soaked hair, looking, for the first time since Eleanor had met him, entirely without the polish and easy confidence he usually carried like a second coat. "I owe you more than gratitude," he said. "I owe you an honest account of exactly how wrong I was about you, and I intend to give it, if you'll permit me." Eleanor leaned against a wooden support beam, arms crossed, rain still dripping steadily from the hem of her father's old coat, and gestured for him to continue. "I said what I said at the garden party, because it was easy," Ashford admitted. "Because I had never once had to think seriously about what it meant to work land, to depend on it, to fear losing it. I assumed, without any real thought at all, that a woman who dressed well and spoke politely at dinners could not possibly understand anything beyond dinners and polite conversation. It was thoughtless, and it was cruel, and worse than either of those things, it was simply lazy. I never bothered to look past what was convenient to assume." Eleanor listened without interrupting, watching him carefully, weighing the sincerity in his voice against 2 years of learning not to trust easy words from people who had never needed to prove anything with actions. "You joked that I would faint at the sight of mud," she said finally. "I have spent 2 years managing my family's land with my own 2 hands, because my father's death left our accounts in ruin, and there was no one else willing or able to save what remained. I have walked fields in far worse conditions than today's storm. I have made mistakes that cost us dearly, and I have learned from every single one of them, because there was no other choice available to me. Mud, Your Grace, has never once frightened me. What frightens me is watching people who have never had to earn anything assume that everyone around them lives the same easy life they do." Ashford absorbed this without flinching, though something in his expression shifted, a kind of quiet reckoning passing behind his eyes. "I understand that now," he said. "I understood it the moment I rode into that field and found you already organizing my entire harvest, better than I had managed to organize it myself all day. I have spent my whole life being told, in one way or another, that everything would simply be handled for me. Turner handled the farming. My father's solicitors handled the finances. Servants handled the house. I never once had to sit with the fear you must have felt, sitting alone with your father's ledgers, realizing how much depended entirely on you." "It is not a fear I would wish on anyone," Eleanor said quietly, some of the guardedness in her voice easing slightly. but it taught me things I would not trade for an easier life. I know my land now. I know the people who work it. I know what a bad season costs a family, down to the last measure of grain. I do not think I could have learned any of that if everything had simply been handled for me. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer and louder than before, and the barn's old wooden beams creaked under the force of the wind pressing against the roof. Nobody inside flinched. The wheat was safe. The workers were sheltered. Whatever the storm still had left to give, it could no longer take from them what mattered most. Ashford looked at Eleanor for a long moment, rain still dripping from both their soaked and mud-streaked clothes, and something in his expression settled into a quiet, unmistakable sincerity that had nothing to do with the polished charm he usually offered at garden parties and dinners. "Whatever debt I owe you for today," he said, "I do not think gratitude alone will ever fully repay it, but I intend to try, starting with making certain every family on this land knows exactly whose hands truly saved their winter." Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first real smile she had offered him since the moment he mocked her a week earlier. "Your gratitude is appreciated, Your Grace, but perhaps we discuss repayment once I am no longer standing in a barn covered head to toe in your mud." Ashford, despite the exhaustion in his limbs and the ache in his hands, found himself laughing, a real laugh this time, warm and unguarded, entirely unlike the careless laughter he had offered at his own garden party the week before. Outside, the storm continued to rage against the fields, but inside the barn, surrounded by the harvest they had saved together, something quieter, and far more lasting, had already begun to take root between them. The storm passed by early morning, leaving behind a countryside washed clean and glittering under a pale, watery sun, and word of what had happened in the western field spread through the tenant families of Merrow Hall faster than any formal announcement could have managed. Susan Pretty heard it first, from her husband Walter, who had spent the following morning walking the recovered field with a kind of disbelieving wonder, running his hands over stacks of safely gathered wheat that, by every reasonable expectation, should have been lying ruined in the mud. He came home that evening and told Susan the whole story, how a young woman from the neighboring estate had ridden onto the Duke's land uninvited, organized a scattered and desperate group of workers into an efficient team, and personally labored through the worst of the storm alongside them, until every last measure of wheat was safely under cover. "They're saying it was Lady Hartley," Walter said, shaking his head as if he still could not quite believe it. "The quiet one, from Ivy Grange. Nobody thought much of her, one way or the other, but Harmon says he's never seen anyone organize a field faster in 30 years of harvests." Susan, holding her youngest child against her hip, felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, thinking of how close her family had come to a hungry winter, and how a woman she had never once met had ridden through a terrible storm to prevent it. Similar conversations played out in cottages across the estate over the following days, and though neither Eleanor nor Ashford made any grand public announcement about what had happened, the story traveled anyway, the way true stories built on real courage tend to travel, passed quietly from one grateful family to the next. Ashford, for his part, spent those first days after the storm doing something he had rarely done in his life, which was paying close and careful attention to the daily workings of his own estate. He visited Turner's cottage twice to check on the steward's recovery, listening more attentively than he ever had before to the old man's explanations of how the farming operations truly functioned. He rode out to the western field himself each morning, watching the remaining harvest work continue under Turner's returning guidance, and he found himself, for the first time, genuinely curious about details he had once considered beneath his notice. He also found himself thinking, far more often than he expected, about Eleanor Hartley. It was not simply gratitude, though gratitude was certainly part of it. It was the persistent memory of her standing in that storm, mud-streaked and utterly unafraid, giving orders with a calm certainty that had steadied an entire field of frightened, exhausted workers. It was the memory of her honest words in the barn afterward, unflinching and direct, refusing to let him settle for easy apologies without truly understanding what he had gotten wrong. 3 days after the storm, Ashford rode to Ivy Grange himself, a visit he had never once made in all the years their estates had shared a border, and he arrived to find the old manor house, somewhat worn at the edges but clearly cared for, its gardens neatly kept despite an obvious lack of extensive resources. Lady Margaret Hartley greeted him with visible astonishment, quickly smoothing her skirts and calling for tea, clearly uncertain what had brought the Duke of Marrow Hall to her door without any prior notice, but eager, in the way of mothers everywhere, to make the most of an unexpected and promising visit. Eleanor herself appeared a few minutes later, having been called in from the fields, and Ashford noted, with a private and unexpected warmth, that she had not bothered changing from her work clothes before joining them, though she had at least removed the worst of the day's mud from her boots. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head politely, though there was a faint, knowing curiosity in her expression that suggested she was fully aware this visit was not merely a matter of formal courtesy. "Lady Hartley," Ashford said, and then, after a brief hesitation, "I find I owe you a debt I have been turning over in my mind for 3 days, and I have not yet found an adequate way to repay it." Lady Margaret, sensing something important passing between the two of them that she did not fully understand, excused herself with unusual grace, murmuring something about checking on the tea, and left them alone in the sitting room. "You do not owe me anything, Your Grace," Eleanor said, once her mother had gone. "I did what needed doing, for your tenants as much as for you." "That is precisely the point," Ashford said. "You rode through a dangerous storm to save a harvest that was not yours, to protect families you had never met, expecting nothing in return, while I stood by that entire day, barely understanding what my own land required. I have thought of little else these past 3 days." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the careless man she had first encountered at his garden party, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the two images no longer seemed to belong to the same person at all. "What is it you came here to say, Your Grace?" she asked finally, direct as always, unwilling to let him circle the point indefinitely. Ashford took a breath, and for a man who had spent his entire life offering easy, practiced words at dinners and parties, he found himself suddenly, genuinely uncertain how to phrase what he actually meant. "I came to say that I misjudged you badly, and that misjudgment has cost me an accurate understanding of exactly the kind of person you are. I would like the chance to correct that, properly, over time, if you would permit it. Not out of gratitude alone, though gratitude is certainly part of what I feel, but because I have not been able to stop thinking about the woman who stood in my field during that storm, entirely unafraid, entirely capable, entirely unlike anyone I have ever known." Eleanor felt something warm and unfamiliar rise in her chest, an emotion she had not expected and was not entirely sure how to name, but she kept her expression composed, unwilling to let 2 years of hard-won independence dissolve too quickly under the weight of a single kind speech, however sincere it sounded. "You may call again, Your Grace," she said carefully, "properly, and with fair warning next time, so my mother does not spend the entire visit fretting over whether the tea is fine enough for a duke." Ashford laughed, warmly, and without any trace of the careless edge that had marked his laughter at the garden party, and something settled between them in that moment, quiet and steady, the beginning of an understanding, built not on society's expectations or careless first impressions, but on mud and storms, and the honest respect earned through shared labor when everything depended on getting the work right. Over the following weeks, Ashford called at Ivy Grange more than once, each visit a little less formal than the last, and Eleanor found herself, cautiously and against her own long-held guardedness, beginning to look forward to them. He asked her, on one visit, to walk him through her drainage improvements along the eastern stream, genuinely curious rather than merely polite, and she found herself explaining with an enthusiasm she rarely allowed herself to show in front of anyone from his side of society. He returned to Marrow Hall from these visits with a growing understanding not just of Eleanor herself, but of the land he had inherited and the people who depended on it, and slowly, steadily, the careless young duke, who had once joked easily about mud and fainting ladies, began to give way to a man who paid closer attention, asked better questions, and understood, finally, the true weight of everything his title had handed him. Months passed, and the wheat that Eleanor and the tenant workers had saved that stormy afternoon was long since milled and sold, the proceeds carrying every family on the Marrow Hall estate safely and comfortably through the winter that followed. Turner recovered fully from his illness and resumed his duties as steward, though he noticed, with quiet approval, that the Duke now asked far more thoughtful questions about the running of the estate than he ever had before. Daniel Cobb returned from his sister's household once her husband had healed, and found the harvest already brought in, and the estate's affairs in steadier order than he had left them, a fact that puzzled him greatly, until the full story reached his ears. Peter's ankle healed cleanly within a few weeks, and he took to telling the story of the storm to anyone who would listen, embellishing it a little more with each retelling, until in his version, Eleanor had single-handedly lifted an entire cart from the mud with her bare hands. Eleanor, when she heard this version secondhand, only laughed and did not bother correcting it, understanding that some stories grow in the telling because people need something to hold on to, something larger than themselves, especially after a season that had frightened everyone as badly as that storm had. By early spring, the same garden at Marrow Hall, where Ashford had once made his careless remark about mud and fainting ladies, was hosting another gathering, this one marking the estate's safe passage through winter and the promising start of a new planting season. Many of the same guests who had laughed along with the Duke's joke months earlier were in attendance once again, though the atmosphere among them now carried a different quality entirely, shaped by a story that had, by this point, traveled well beyond the tenant cottages and into the drawing rooms of society itself. Eleanor arrived that evening in a fine gown rather than her father's old work coat, though anyone who looked closely might still have noticed the faint calluses on her hands, evidence of a life lived with far more purpose and labor than most women in that garden had ever known. She moved through the gathering with a quiet confidence that had not existed in her the previous year, no longer the overlooked young woman standing awkwardly at the edge of polite conversation, but someone whose name now carried genuine weight and respect throughout the county. Ashford found her near the same spot where he had once made his thoughtless remark, and something in the small, private smile they exchanged carried the full weight of everything that had happened between that evening and this one. "It seems only right," he said quietly, standing beside her, "that we should return to precisely this spot in the garden, given where this story truly began." "It began with a joke at my expense," Eleanor said, though her tone carried no real bitterness, only the easy comfort of two people who had long since moved past that particular wound. "I would not have chosen this spot for anything sentimental." "Then let us choose it now," Ashford said, "for something better than what it once represented." Word had continued to spread among the tenant families throughout the winter, quiet and persistent, the way true stories of courage tend to spread among people who understand exactly what such courage costs, and exactly what it saves. Susan Pretty told it to her children as they grew, a story of a brave and capable lady who had ridden through a terrible storm to save their winter meals, and Walter repeated it at the local tavern more times than he could count, always ending with the same observation, that he had never in his life seen anyone work a field harder than Lady Hartley had that day, storm or no storm. Neither Eleanor nor Ashford ever confirmed every detail of the story as it grew and traveled, understanding that some exaggeration was simply the natural result of people needing hope to hold on to after a season that had frightened them badly. But neither did they deny the heart of it, because the heart of it was true. A woman dismissed as fragile had proven, through courage and hard-won skill, exactly how mistaken that judgment had been, and a man who had once cared only for easy laughter had learned, through mud and storm and honest labor beside her, the true weight of the responsibilities he carried. As the evening wore on, and the garden filled with warm lantern light and easy conversation, Ashford glanced toward Eleanor more than once, watching her speak with genuine warmth to tenant families who had once been strangers to her, but who now greeted her, wherever she went on Marrow Hall's land, with open gratitude and clear affection. "You have changed how this estate sees itself," he said to her quietly, later that evening, as the last of the guests began to depart into the cool spring night. "Not just the harvest you saved, though that alone would have been enough. You have changed how I see it, and how I intend to run it going forward." Eleanor considered this for a moment, watching the last lanterns flicker in the gentle evening breeze, so different from the howling wind of that storm months earlier. "Then perhaps," she said, "the mud was worth something after all." Ashford laughed, warm and unguarded, the laugh of a man who had finally learned to see clearly, rather than assume carelessly, and as they stood together in that garden, the same garden where a thoughtless joke had once been spoken, and where an honest understanding now quietly bloomed in its place, both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever came next between them would be built on something far sturdier than society's careless judgments. It would be built on mud and storms and the kind of respect that could only be earned through shared struggle. And neither of them, standing together under that clear spring sky, wanted it built on anything less.